Sometimes the loneliest people make the most extraordinary choices. 67-year-old Igris Stoneheart had given up on human kindness 20 years ago when he built his cabin deep in Wyoming's wilderness. But on one bitter February night in 1887, when snow falls like a blanket over the mountains, something changes his heart forever. Through his window, he sees a wounded creature protecting two small ones from the freezing cold. Every part of him says to stay inside and mind his own business. But something deeper tells him to open that door. What happens next becomes a story about family, courage, and the choices that define us. But will his choice to protect these mysterious creatures cost him everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through ice-crusted windows, casting prismatic patterns across the rough-hewn walls of Igris Stoneheart's cabin. He had built this sanctuary with his own hands 20 winters ago, each log selected and placed with the meticulous care of a man who knew it might be his final earthly dwelling. The structure stood solid against the Wyoming wind, a testament to both his craftsmanship and his determination to live and die on his own terms. Igris moved through his morning routine with the practiced economy of a man who had stripped life down to its essentials. The arthritic joints in his hands protested as he coaxed life back into the embers of last night's fire, but he worked through the pain with the stoicism that had carried him through 2 decades of solitude. The flames caught, casting dancing shadows that had been his only companions for longer than he cared to. Remember, on the small table beside his bed sat his most prized possession, a hand-carved chess set he had crafted during his second winter in the mountains. Each piece bore the marks of countless evenings spent in silent games against himself. The white king worn smooth by his weathered thumb, the black queen bearing a small chip from the night he had thrown her against the wall in frustration, not at the game, but at the memories it stirred of better times, of opponents who could laugh at a clever move or groan at a strategic blunder. The chess set had been carved from mountain ash, the same tree from which he had fashioned the beams that held his roof steady against the weight of winter snow. It was fitting, he supposed, that his greatest comfort and his shelter should spring from the same root. The pieces stood in their eternal formation, mid-game frozen in time, a position he had been pondering for 3 days now, though he could not remember which side he was meant to play next. His cabin measured just 20 feet by 16, but every inch served a purpose. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserved vegetables from his summer garden, dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, and the various tinctures and salves he brewed from mountain plants. A lifetime of frontier living had taught him to read the language of herbs, willow bark for pain, echinacea for the chest congestion that plagued him each winter, chamomile for the nights when sleep proved as elusive as human companionship. The leather pouch containing his healing herbs hung beside the door, within easy reach. Inside, carefully wrapped bundles held the knowledge accumulated through trial, error, and the hard-won wisdom of a man who had been his own doctor for longer than most men lived. Each herb had saved his life at least once, and he treated them with the reverence other men reserved for scripture or gold. Against the far wall stood his workbench, scarred by decades of use. Here he had carved not only the chess set, but countless other necessities: bowls, spoons, handles for tools worn beyond repair. The wood shavings that accumulated beneath it served as kindling, ensuring that nothing in his small world went to waste. Waste was a luxury he had never been able to afford, and now, in what he suspected were his final years, frugality had become a point of pride. His rifle hung above the fireplace, cleaned and oiled despite weeks without use. The winter had been harsh enough to drive even the hardiest game to lower elevations, leaving him to subsist on his preserved stores and the occasional rabbit foolish enough to venture near his cabin. He was a fair shot, though not the marksman he had been in his younger days. Age had stiffened his joints and clouded his eyes, but his hands remained steady when necessity demanded. The isolation had not always been his choice. 20 years ago, he had fled to these mountains, carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh, seeking a place where the past could not follow. The details of that flight remained locked away, surfacing only in dreams or in the moments between sleep and waking when his defenses were down. There had been a woman, Sarah, and accusations that turned neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. There had been fire and screaming and the terrible choice between truth and survival. He had chosen survival then, but survival of the body only. His heart, his spirit, his capacity for trust, these had been left behind in the ashes of his former life. The mountains had offered refuge, but not healing. Healing required hope, and hope was a luxury he had long since abandoned. Yet as he moved through his morning tasks, banking the fire, checking his snares through the small window, reviewing his dwindling food stores, Igris felt the stirring of something he had not experienced in years. Perhaps it was merely the approach of spring, still months away, but whispered in the subtle shift of the wind. Perhaps it was simply the acknowledgement that this winter, unlike the 19 that had preceded it, might truly be his last. His body was failing in small but noticeable ways. The climb to his woodpile left him breathless. His appetite had diminished, making each meal a conscious effort rather than a pleasure. Most telling of all, he found himself thinking more often of the past, of faces he had tried to forget, and words that should have been spoken before it was too late. The chess game beckoned from its place beside his bed. He had been playing both sides for so long that he sometimes forgot which pieces belonged to whom. The White King stood exposed, vulnerable to attack from 3 different directions. The Black Queen commanded the center of the board with imperial authority. It was a position that demanded careful thought, strategic planning, the kind of deep consideration that could occupy a man for hours. But today, for reasons he could not name, the game held no appeal. Instead, he found himself drawn to the window, gazing out at the pristine wilderness that had been his world for 2 decades. The snow lay deep and unmarked, a white canvas stretching to the horizon. In summer, this view included wildflower meadows and stands of aspen that turned golden in the fall. But winter reduced the world to its elemental components: white earth, grey sky, the dark verticals of pine and spruce. It was beautiful in its stark simplicity, and it was utterly without human warmth. For 20 years, this had been enough. The mountains asked nothing of him except respect for their power and patience with their moods. They offered in return a kind of peace that was not happiness but was not quite despair either. It was existence pared down to its essentials, life without the complications that had driven him to this exile. But lately, in the deep quiet of winter nights, he had begun to wonder if mere existence was enough. If a man could live so long in isolation that he forgot what it meant to be human, if the price of safety might be higher than the cost of connection, these were dangerous thoughts for a man in his position. Doubt was a luxury he could not afford, any more than he could afford to waste food or let his fire die. Yet the thoughts persisted, stubborn as the frost that formed new patterns on his windows each morning. He returned to his chess set, studying the position with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The White King's predicament seemed hopeless, surrounded by enemies with no clear path to safety. Yet chess, like life, was a game where the most desperate positions sometimes offered the most creative solutions. Sometimes survival required not avoiding risk, but embracing it completely. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, rattling the shutters and whistling through the gaps in the cabin's chinked walls. Another storm was coming. He could feel it in the ache of his joints and taste it in the air that seeped through the cracks. It would be a bad one, the kind that could trap a man for days and test the limits of even the most carefully laid preparations. Igris Stoneheart moved methodically through his storm preparations, securing shutters and checking supplies with the thoroughness of a man who understood that in the wilderness, small oversights could become fatal mistakes. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the chess game, about kings under siege, and queens commanding empty boards. He did not yet know that by tomorrow everything would change, that the storm approaching would bring more than snow and wind, that his carefully ordered world of solitude and routine was about to be shattered by an encounter that would force him to remember what it meant to choose compassion over safety, love over survival. The White King waited on the board, surrounded by danger but not yet defeated. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, footsteps were approaching through the snow, footsteps too large to be human, yet too purposeful to be entirely wild. The storm arrived with a fury that reminded Igris why even the most experienced mountain men respected winter's wrath. By evening, the wind howled like a thing possessed, driving snow horizontally against his cabin with enough force to rattle the sturdy walls he had built to withstand decades of such assaults. This was different, though, bigger and more vicious than anything he had weathered in recent memory. He had secured everything that could be secured, double-checked his firewood supply, and prepared for what might be several days of confinement. The chess game still waited, the White King's plight unchanged, but tonight even that familiar puzzle could not hold his attention. Something in the storm's voice seemed to speak directly to the unease that had been growing in his chest for weeks. The temperature had plummeted with the sun, and ice began forming on the inside of his windows, despite the fire burning steadily in his hearth. Igris pulled his heaviest blanket around his shoulders and settled into his chair, content to wait out nature's tantrum, as he had so many times before. The isolation that had once felt like protection now seemed fragile, a thin shell between him and forces far greater than one old man could comprehend or control. It was near midnight when he first heard them. The sounds came from beyond his door, not the random creaking and groaning of wood under stress, but something deliberate, rhythmic, the soft thud of heavy footsteps in deep snow, moving with purpose despite the blizzard's fury. Igris froze, his weathered hand instinctively reaching for the rifle above the mantel. In 20 years of mountain solitude, no human being had approached his cabin uninvited. The few trappers and prospectors who knew of his existence respected his desire for privacy, and the harsh winter had driven even the most desperate men to lower elevations weeks ago. Whatever moved outside his door was either lost beyond all reason or something other than human. The footsteps stopped directly. Outside his entrance, the heavy oak door that served as both portal and barrier between his ordered world and the chaos of the wilderness. Igris remained motionless, scarcely breathing, straining to hear over the storm's roar. Then came a sound that raised every hair on his weathered neck, a low, rumbling vocalization that was neither human speech nor animal growl, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between the two, moving with the careful silence of a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Igris crept to the small window beside his door. The glass was thick with ice, but he scraped away enough to create a narrow viewing slot. What he saw beyond defied every rational thought he had ever entertained. A massive creature stood in his dooryard, easily 8 feet tall, even as it hunched protectively over two smaller forms huddled against its legs. The thing, he could find no better word, was covered in thick dark fur that the wind whipped into wild patterns. Its face, partially visible in the dim light that escaped his frosted windows, bore an unsettling mixture of human intelligence and animal wariness. But it was the smaller forms that stopped his breath entirely. Two young ones, clearly offspring of the massive creature, pressed close to their mother's legs for warmth and protection. They were perhaps 4 feet tall, covered in lighter fur, and even through the storm's fury he could see them shivering violently. The mother creature, for there was no doubt in his mind that this was a family group, turned her head toward his cabin. In that moment, their eyes met through the narrow gap he had scraped in the ice. What he saw there was not the blank stare of a wild animal, but something far more disturbing: intelligence, desperation, and unmistakable hope. She raised one massive hand, and it was a hand, not a paw. with fingers that ended in thick claws, and made a gesture toward the door. The meaning was clear, a request for shelter, for sanctuary from the storm that threatened to claim all 3 lives. Igris stepped back from the window, his mind reeling. Every instinct honed by decades of frontier survival screamed warnings. These creatures, whatever they were, represented danger on a scale he had never contemplated. They could crush him without effort, tear his cabin apart like kindling, take whatever they wanted and leave his bones for the spring thaw. Yet as he stood there, back pressed against his door, he could hear the smaller ones making soft sounds of distress. They were frightened, cold, and clearly suffering in conditions that would kill them before dawn if they found no shelter. The mother's rumbling vocalizations had taken on a pleading quality that transcended species. His gaze fell on the chess set, on the White King surrounded by threats, but not yet defeated. Sometimes survival required not avoiding risk, but embracing it completely. Sometimes the most desperate positions offered the most creative solutions. The heavy oak door had protected him from the outside world for 20 years. It had been his fortress, his final barrier against the complications and betrayals that had driven him to this exile. Opening it now would mean abandoning the safety he had so carefully constructed, inviting the unknown into the ordered sanctuary he had built. But as another gust of wind shook his cabin, and he heard the young ones whimper with cold, Igris Stoneheart made a choice that would have seemed impossible just moments before. His weathered hand moved to the heavy wooden bar that secured his door. The wind nearly tore the door from his grasp as he pulled it open, and snow swirled into his cabin like a living thing. The creature family stood exactly where he had seen them, the mother positioned protectively in front of her young. Up close, she was even more imposing. Broad shoulders, powerful limbs, and a face that combined the nobility of human features with the primal strength of something that had never known civilization's compromises. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, they regarded each other across his threshold. Then, with a gesture that spoke of caution born from bitter experience, the mother creature took a single step forward. Her massive foot crossed from the wild chaos of the storm into the warm sanctuary of his cabin. "Come in," Igris whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "All of you. Quickly now." The family moved with surprising grace for creatures of such size. The mother entered first, her intelligent eyes never leaving his face, ready to defend her young if this proved to be a trap. The cubs followed close behind, pressing against their mothers, legs but casting curious glances around the cabin that had suddenly become their shelter. Igris closed the door against the storm and secured it with hands that trembled only slightly. When he turned back to face his unexpected guests, he found them clustered near the fireplace, drawn to the warmth, but careful not to approach too closely. The mother continued to watch him, with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. "You're hurt," he said, noting the way she favored her left arm and the dark stains in her fur that could only be blood. Without waiting for a response she could not give, he moved to retrieve his leather pouch of healing herbs. What followed was the most surreal hour of his life. The mother creature allowed him to examine her wounds, deep cuts from what looked like barbed wire, probably acquired during their desperate journey to find shelter. He cleaned and dressed them with supplies meant for human ailments, working by firelight while 2 young Bigfoot watched his every move with unblinking fascination. The cubs, for he had no doubt now what these creatures were. Despite every rational objection his mind could muster, gradually relaxed as their mother showed no signs of alarm. They explored his small cabin with the boundless curiosity of children everywhere, touching his belongings with surprisingly gentle hands and making soft sounds that might have been commentary or questions. When he offered them food, dried meat and winter vegetables from his carefully hoarded stores, they accepted with a gratitude that transcended language. The mother's eyes met his over the heads of her feeding young, and in that moment, Igris understood that he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The storm raged outside, But within his cabin, a warmth had taken root that had nothing to do with the fire on his hearth. As the creatures settled near the flames and the cub's breathing deepened into sleep, Igris Stoneheart realized that his 20 years of solitude had ended with the opening of a door. Tomorrow would bring new complications, new dangers, new choices he could not yet imagine. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he was not alone. Dawn arrived grey and subdued, the storm having exhausted itself sometime before sunrise. Igris woke from an uneasy sleep to find his cabin transformed by the presence of 3 impossible guests. The mother creature sat upright near the dying embers of his fire, clearly having maintained watch throughout the night while her cubs slept, curled together like enormous puppies on his floor. The sight should have terrified him. Instead, as he observed the protective way she positioned herself between her young and any potential threat, he felt something he had not experienced in 20 years, a kinship born of shared responsibility. "Good morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle the cubs. The mother's head turned toward him, and he caught something in her expression that might have been amusement at his attempt at normal courtesy in such extraordinary circumstances. The cubs stirred at the sound of his voice, stretching with the unconscious grace of healthy young animals. In daylight, he could see their individual characteristics more clearly. The larger one, whom he mentally dubbed Bold, had darker fur and moved with confidence that bordered on swagger. The smaller one, Cautious, hung back and watched everything with enormous eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of this strange human dwelling. Igris retrieved his worn leather pouch of healing herbs, the familiar weight of it in his hands, providing some anchor to reality in this surreal morning. The mother's wounds needed fresh attention, and he had learned long ago that injuries left untended in mountain conditions could quickly turn deadly. She submitted to his ministrations with surprising patience, even lifting her injured arm to give him better access to the cuts. The wounds were healing well. Her people, whatever they were, apparently possessed robust constitutions. As he applied fresh salve made from pine resin and mountain herbs, she watched his hands with intense interest, as if memorizing his techniques. "You're a quick healer," he murmured, more to fill the strange silence than because he expected understanding. But something in her soft rumble of response suggested she had caught his meaning, if not his words. The cubs, meanwhile, had discovered his chess set. Bold approached the carved pieces with the fearless curiosity that seemed to define his personality, reaching out to touch the White Queen with one surprisingly delicate finger. Cautious hung back initially, but when no disaster resulted from his siblings' investigation, crept closer to examine the mysterious objects. Igris found himself holding his breath as they explored the game that had been his sole companion for so long. These pieces represented thousands of hours of solitary thought, strategies contemplated and reconsidered, the endless internal dialogue of a man with no one else to talk to. Now they were toys in the hands of creatures that existed only in legends and fevered dreams. But rather than resentment, he felt a strange satisfaction watching their gentle investigation. The cubs handled each piece with care, turning them over to examine the carved details, occasionally making soft sounds that might have been commentary or questions directed at each other. The mother watched this interaction intently, and when Bold grew bold enough to attempt moving a piece, she made a sharp sound that clearly meant, "Be careful." Universal parenting. Igris reflected, "Transcended species. It's a game," he said, settling cross-legged beside the board. Both cubs looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for further explanation. "You move the pieces like this." He demonstrated a simple knight's move, explaining as he went, even though he knew they could not understand his words. Each piece has its own way of moving, its own strengths and weaknesses. What followed was perhaps the most unusual chess lesson ever conducted. The cubs watched with rapt attention as he demonstrated how each piece moved, their intelligence obvious in the way they quickly grasped the patterns. Bold attempted to copy his moves, sometimes successfully, While Cautious seemed content to observe and learn, the mother settled beside them, close enough to intervene if necessary, but allowing her children to explore this new experience. Occasionally, she would make soft sounds that seemed to be encouragement or gentle correction, a language Igris was beginning to recognize even if he could not speak it. As the morning progressed, the reality of his situation began to sink in. His carefully calculated food stores, meant to last one man through the remainder of winter, would not stretch to feed 3 additional mouths, especially mouths belonging to creatures of such size. The cubs alone probably consumed more in a day than he ate in 3. He began inventorying his supplies with the methodical approach that had kept him alive through 19 previous winters. Dried meat, preserved vegetables, flour, beans, all adequate for his needs, woefully insufficient for 4. At his current rate of consumption, including his guests, he would be out of food in less than 2 weeks. The mother seemed to sense his concern. When he opened various containers to check their contents, she watched closely, her expression growing more troubled with each inspection. When he reached the nearly empty flour barrel, she made a sound that was unmistakably distressed. "Don't worry," he said, though worry was exactly what he felt. "We'll figure something out. Always have before." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, his mind was already working on the problem. The hunting would be poor until the weather improved, and even then, taking enough game to feed 3 additional mouths would require skills he was no longer certain he possessed. His traps were set for rabbits and small game, not the larger animals that would be necessary now. The cubs, oblivious to these practical concerns, had returned to exploring his cabin with the boundless energy of children. They investigated his cooking implements, his sleeping area, his workbench with its accumulated projects. Everything fascinated them, but they touched gently, as if understanding that these things belonged to someone who had been kind to them. Bold discovered his collection of carved wooden bowls and began arranging them in patterns, while Cautious found his leather-working tools and examined them with the serious concentration of a scholar. Their mother watched indulgently, intervening only when their curiosity threatened to become destructive. Despite the practical concerns gnawing at him, Igris found himself oddly content. For 20 years, his cabin had been filled only with silence and his own thoughts. Now it buzzed with life, soft conversations between the cubs in their incomprehensible language, the mother's gentle corrections, the sounds of exploration and discovery. It was, he realized, the sound of family, something he had thought lost to him forever. As afternoon approached, the cubs began showing signs of restlessness. They had explored every corner of his small domain and were clearly accustomed to a larger world. The mother recognized their need and began making preparation sounds that suggested departure might be imminent. "Stay," Igris found himself saying, the word emerging before he could consider its implications. "At least until the weather clears completely. It's still dangerous out there." The mother regarded him steadily, as if weighing his sincerity against her own protective instincts. Finally, she nodded, an unmistakably human gesture that sent chills down his spine. Outside, the wind had died to whispers, but snow continued to fall in the desultory way that suggested more storms were building in the distance. Inside his cabin, 3 impossible guests had made themselves at home, transforming his ordered solitude into something he could not yet name, but was reluctant to lose. The chess game waited, pieces now scattered by curious hands, but not forgotten. The White King remained in peril, but somehow that seemed less important now. Sometimes Igris was beginning to understand. Survival was less about protecting what you had, and more about embracing what you might become. The 3rd day brought clear skies and the harsh reality of dwindling supplies. Igris woke before dawn, as had been his habit for decades, but now found the mother creature already alert and watching the door. Her posture suggested she had heard something. In the pre-dawn darkness, something that had raised her protective instincts to high. Alert, he dressed quietly and retrieved his hand-forged hunting knife from its place beside his bed. The blade had been crafted by his own father 40 years ago. The steel folded and refolded until it held an edge that could split mountain wind. More than a tool, it represented both his means of provision and protection, the dual responsibilities that now weighed heavier with 3 additional lives depending on his competence. "I need to hunt," he whispered to the mother, though he felt foolish speaking to a creature that could not possibly understand human language. Yet something in her intelligent gaze suggested she grasped his meaning. She made a soft sound that might have been acknowledgement or concern. The cubs were still sleeping, curled together near the fireplace where the embers cast dancing shadows on their peaceful faces. Bold had one massive paw draped protectively over Cautious, a gesture so human in its tenderness that Igris felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He stepped outside into air so cold it burned his lungs, but the crystalline clarity told him the weather would hold. His tracks from 2 days ago had been obliterated by the storm, but now he could move freely through the forest without leaving obvious signs of his presence. Old habits from his years of avoiding human contact served him well now. The snow was deep, but not impossible, and he moved through it with the patient efficiency of a man who understood that haste in the wilderness often led to injury or death. His destination was a game trail he had discovered years ago, where deer sometimes passed in the early morning hours. With luck, he might take something large enough to ease the pressure on his stores. What he found instead sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Human tracks, fresh ones, at least 3 sets, moving with purpose through the forest in a pattern that spoke of organization and intent. The men who had made these tracks were not lost travelers or casual hunters. They moved like predators, searching for specific prey. Igris knelt beside the clearest print, his experienced eye reading the story written in the snow. Heavy boots, probably military issue. Deep impressions suggesting men carrying significant weight, supplies for an extended hunt, or equipment for capturing something alive. Most disturbing of all, the tracks circled his general area in a pattern that suggested systematic searching. He followed the trail for perhaps a quarter mile before finding what made his blood run cold. A crude camp, hastily abandoned, but recent enough that he could smell the lingering smoke from their fire. Scattered around the site were things that told a story he wished he did not have to read. Lengths of rope, far heavier than needed for normal purposes. Iron chains that could restrain something much larger and stronger than a human being. Most ominous of all, crude drawings scratched in the dirt. Tall figures with long arms and broad shoulders that could only represent one thing. They knew. Somehow, someone had discovered that the legends were real. And now men were coming to claim the prize. Igris retreated from the camp with the careful silence of a man whose life had once depended on not being detected by enemies. His mind raced as he made his way back through the forest, trying to calculate how much time they might have before the hunters returned. The abandoned camp suggested they had moved on, but whether that meant temporary absence or permanent departure was impossible to know. He arrived back at his cabin to find the mother creature pacing near the door, her anxiety obvious in every line of her massive frame. The cubs sat huddled together, picking up on their mother's distress, though they could not understand its source. "We have a problem," Igris said, and somehow he knew she understood the gravity in his voice, if not his words. He showed her the hunting knife, then made gestures toward the forest that he hoped would convey the presence of danger. Her reaction confirmed his worst fears. She recognized the threat he was describing, her expression shifting from anxiety to something approaching desperation. She moved to her cubs and began making urgent sounds in their mysterious language, warnings, instructions, preparations for flight. But when she turned back to him, instead of moving toward the door, she did something that stopped his breath. She reached out with one massive hand and gently touched his shoulder, her gesture unmistakably protective. She was not just warning her cubs, she was including him in their family circle, accepting responsibility for his safety as he had accepted responsibility for theirs. The simple gesture shattered something in Igris that had been frozen for 20 years. This creature, this impossible being that existed only in legends and nightmares, was offering to protect him. She was making him part of her family, not from obligation or debt, but from something deeper, a recognition of shared purpose that transcended species. "No," he said firmly. Though his voice was thick with emotion, he had not expected to feel. "This is my fight now too. We protect each other." What followed was the most remarkable planning session of his life. Using gestures, drawings in the dirt floor, and the few objects in his cabin that could serve as props, they worked out a basic understanding. The mother had knowledge of the terrain that went far beyond his own, secret paths through the mountains, hidden caves that could serve as temporary refuges, places where her people had sheltered from human persecution for generations. The cubs watched this strange conference with wide eyes, occasionally offering their own observations in their soft language. Bold seemed eager to be part of whatever plan they were hatching, while Cautious expressed concern through body language that needed no translation. As the day wore on, a fragile strategy began to emerge. The mother would teach him the hidden paths of her people, while he shared his knowledge of human hunting techniques and behavior. Together, they might stay ahead of the men who sought to capture something they saw only as a prize to be claimed. But even as they planned, Igris felt the weight of what he had committed himself to. He was 67 years old, alone except for 3 creatures the world would call monsters, facing men who would not hesitate to kill him to get what they wanted. By any rational measure, his chances of survival were negligible. Yet as he watched the mother gently tend to her cubs while simultaneously preparing for the fight ahead, he realized that survival had never been the point. Purpose was the point. Family was the point. The choice to stand with those who needed protection rather than fleeing to safety was the point. The chess game sat forgotten on its board, pieces scattered by curious hands, but the essential conflict unchanged. The White King remained surrounded by threats, but now he was no longer alone. Sometimes the most desperate positions offered unexpected alliances, unlikely partnerships that could change the entire game. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the forest, where men with chains and rope were hunting legends. Inside his cabin, Igris Stoneheart was discovering that the family he had lost 20 years ago could be rebuilt in the most impossible ways. With the most unlikely members, the knife at his belt had provided for him alone for decades. Now it would serve a larger purpose, protecting something far more precious than his own solitary existence. The 4th morning brought disturbing news, written in the snow around his cabin. Fresh tracks circled his property in patterns that spoke of careful surveillance. Someone had spent hours watching his dwelling while he slept. Igris stood at his door, studying the evidence with growing alarm. The watchers had come close enough to peer through his windows, close enough to notice any signs of unusual activity. He retreated inside and moved to his small, cracked hand mirror that hung beside his wash basin. The reflection that greeted him showed a man transformed by circumstances he could never have imagined. The solitary hermit who had awakened 4 days ago no longer existed. In his place stood someone with responsibilities that extended far beyond his own survival. A protector, a keeper of secrets that could reshape the world's understanding of what lived in its wild places. "What have you become, Igris Stoneheart?" he asked his reflection, and found no easy answer in the weathered face that stared back. The mother creature watched him with concern, having sensed his agitation from the moment he discovered the tracks. Her intelligence continued to astound him. She understood not just the immediate danger, but its implications for all of them. When he showed her the evidence of nocturnal surveillance, her response was swift and decisive. She gathered her cubs close and began what was clearly a lesson in survival. Her vocalizations took on an urgent quality as she demonstrated how to move silently, how to remain motionless when danger threatened, how to distinguish between safe and dangerous sounds. Bold absorbed the instructions with eager attention, while Cautious seemed to understand instinctively that their playful exploration time had ended. But it was what the mother showed him next that truly opened Igris's eyes to the depth of mystery surrounding these creatures. Leading him to the eastern wall of his cabin, she began tracing patterns in the wooden surface with one massive finger. At first, the marks seemed random, scratches that might have been made by any large animal. But as she continued, a design emerged that was unmistakably deliberate. Symbols that spoke of intelligence, culture, and a history far older than human settlement in these mountains. When she finished her carving, she led him outside to a cluster of aspen trees he had passed countless times without truly seeing. There, carved into bark scarred by decades of weather, were more of the same symbols. And beyond those trees, more markings on other trees, creating a network of communication that stretched through the forest in directions he had never thought to explore. The revelation staggered him. These mountains, which he had considered his private sanctuary, were in truth the homeland of an entire people. The creatures he had taken into his cabin were not wandering myths, but members of an ancient society with its own territories, traditions, and methods of survival. He had been living for 20 years in the heart of their world, without ever knowing they existed. The mother seemed to understand his amazement. She made soft sounds that might have been explanation or reassurance, then began leading him along paths that were invisible to his human eyes, but clearly marked in ways her people could read. Hidden trails wound through seemingly impassable terrain, connecting locations that formed a complex network throughout the high country. As they walked, he and the mother, while the cubs stayed close but alert, Igris began to see his familiar forest through entirely new eyes. What he had taken for natural rock formations were actually carefully constructed shelters. What appeared to be random deadfall was actually strategic placement for defense and concealment. These creatures had been here longer than his people had been dreaming of crossing the ocean to reach this continent. But the ancient markings also told a darker story. Many of the symbols were weathered almost beyond recognition, suggesting that whatever population had once thrived here had dwindled significantly. The mother's desperate search for shelter during the storm began. To make more sense, she might have been looking not just for protection from the weather, but for signs that others of her kind still lived in their traditional territories. They returned to his cabin as afternoon shadows began lengthening, both of them now acutely aware that they were being watched. Igris had spotted at least 2 observation points where someone could monitor his property without being easily detected. The watchers were patient and skilled, suggesting they had significant experience in tracking elusive prey. Inside the cabin, he began teaching the cubs what he could about avoiding human detection. Using his chess pieces as props, he demonstrated concepts of concealment, misdirection, and the importance of leaving no traces. Bold seemed to grasp the strategic elements immediately, while Cautious understood the emotional undercurrents that these lessons were about survival in a hostile world. The mother participated in these lessons, adding her own demonstrations of stealth techniques that put his human skills to shame. Watching her move through his small cabin without making a sound despite her massive size was both impressive and unsettling. Her people had clearly been evading human contact for generations, developing abilities that bordered on the supernatural. As evening approached, the tension in his cabin became palpable. Every sound from outside brought instant alertness from all 4 of them. The cubs had absorbed enough of their situation to understand that their usual curious exploration was now dangerous. They stayed close to their mother, but their eyes frequently sought Igris as well. He had become part of their safety network, one of the adults they looked to for protection. The chess game remained scattered on his table, pieces displaced by small hands, but somehow still meaningful. The White King's predicament had taken on new relevance. Surrounded by threats, his survival dependent on alliances with unlikely protectors. But kings, Igris reflected, were only as strong as those who chose to stand with them. Outside, darkness fell with the weight of approaching danger. Somewhere in the forest, men with chains and capture equipment were planning their next move. They had found evidence of the creature's presence and were closing in with the methodical patience of experienced hunters. Inside his cabin, an aging hermit was discovering that the isolation he had chosen as protection could become a trap unless he was willing to trust in bonds that transcended every logical objection. The cracked mirror by his wash basin reflected not just his face, but his transformation, from a man hiding from the world to one prepared to stand against it. The mother creature settled near his door, taking the first watch while her cubs slept. But her position was protective of more than just her own young. She had positioned herself to guard them all. This impossible family, bound together by circumstances none of them could have predicted. In accepting responsibility for their safety, Igris had found something he thought lost forever, a reason to fight for tomorrow that went beyond his own survival. The chess game could wait. The real contest for king and family had begun. The discovery came by accident, as the most profound revelations often do. While searching through his few personal belongings for anything that might serve as additional tools or weapons, Igris's weathered fingers found the small wooden box he had not opened in 15 years. Hidden beneath spare buttons and forgotten trinkets lay a faded photograph, the last remnant of the life he had fled to these mountains. Sarah's face looked back at him across the decades, her smile captured in sepia tones that had grown soft with age. Beside her stood their daughter Emma, barely 6 years old when the photograph was taken, her eyes bright with the innocent trust that children reserve for a world that has not yet betrayed them. Behind them, Igris himself, younger, hopeful, unaware of the catastrophe that would tear his family apart and drive him into self-imposed exile. His hands trembled as he studied the faces of the dead, emotions he had buried under 20 years of solitude, threatening to overwhelm his carefully constructed defenses. The pain was as sharp as the day he had fled, leaving behind graves and accusations. Choosing survival over the courage to fight for his innocence. A soft sound made him look up to find the mother creature watching him with unmistakable compassion. Without invitation, she moved closer, her massive frame settling beside him with surprising gentleness. When she saw the photograph in his hands, she made a soft, questioning sound that somehow conveyed both curiosity and sympathy. "My family," he whispered, his voice thick with grief that had never fully healed. "Lost them both. Cholera took Emma first, then Sarah 3 days later. I was away hunting for medicine in the next territory. Came back to find them buried, and half the town ready to string me up for abandoning them." The mother creature could not understand his words, but she clearly comprehended his pain. With infinite care, she reached out and gently touched the photograph, her massive finger tracing the outline of the little girl's face. When she looked back at Igris, her eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended language. She rose and moved to where her own cubs slept, gesturing for him to follow. As he watched, she gently woke bold and cautious, speaking to them in their soft language while indicating Igris and the photograph he still held. Whatever she told them, their reaction was immediate and touching. Both cubs approached him with the solemn consideration children reserve for moments they sense are important, bold. With his usual confidence, reached out and carefully took the photograph from Igris's hands. He studied it intently, then looked between the image and the old man's face, clearly recognizing the resemblance. Cautious hung back initially, but when Bold made encouraging sounds, she too came forward to examine this glimpse into their protector's past. What happened next drove home the remarkable intelligence of these creatures. The mother began making soft vocalizations while touching her cubs, then touching Igris, then indicating the photograph. The message was clear. She was explaining to her young that families could be lost, That loss was a pain shared by all thinking beings, but that new families could form from unexpected sources. The cubs seemed to absorb this lesson with the gravity it deserved. When their mother finished speaking, Bold carefully returned the photograph to Igris, but then did something that nearly broke the old man's heart. The young creature gently patted Igris's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that was unmistakably learned from watching his mother care for others. As the night deepened, Igris found himself sharing more than he had intended. The photograph had unlocked memories he had spent decades trying to suppress. And in the presence of these creatures who offered no judgment, only acceptance, the words began to flow. He told them about Sarah's laugh, about Emma's fascination with the wildflowers that grew around their cabin, about the dreams they had shared for a larger family and a prosperous future. He spoke of the fever that took his daughter while he was away seeking medicine, of returning to find his wife dead from grief and sickness, of the neighbors who whispered that a man who truly cared for his family would never have left them alone. The mother creature listened with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told, regardless of whether the listener could comprehend the words. Her cubs dozed fitfully, but they too seemed to sense that this was a moment of importance, a sharing of pain that somehow lessened its burden. But the peaceful intimacy of the evening was shattered by sounds from outside, the deliberate cracking of branches that spoke of human movement through the forest. The mother was on her feet instantly, every line of her body radiating protective tension. The cubs woke immediately, their playful demeanor replaced by the alert wariness of prey animals sensing predators. Igris moved to his window and carefully scraped away ice to create a viewing slot. What he saw made his blood run cold. Torches moved through the forest in a pattern that spoke of organized hunting. At least 5 men, possibly more, advancing on his cabin with the methodical precision of experienced trackers. "They've found us," he whispered, though the words were unnecessary. The mother creature was already gathering her cubs, preparing for the flight that had become inevitable. But as she moved toward the door, Igris realized with crystalline clarity that running would only delay the inevitable. These hunters had the resources and determination to pursue their quarry as long as necessary. They would track the creatures across every mountain, through every valley, until they had claimed their prize. The only way to truly protect his impossible family was to make the hunters understand that some prizes came with costs too high to pay. "No," he said firmly, his hand moving to the hunting knife at his belt. "This ends here." The mother creature turned to stare at him, and in her intelligent eyes he saw the same calculation he was making. They could run, but running would mean a life of constant fear for her cubs, constant vigilance, constant danger. Or they could make their stand here, in this place that had become their sanctuary, and fight for the right to exist in peace. The cubs sensed the change in their mother's posture, the shift from flight to fight that marked a decision point in their young lives. Bold moved closer to Igris, his small hand reaching out to touch the old man's leg in a gesture of solidarity. Even cautious, despite her natural wariness, positioned herself where she could support the adults if needed. The photograph lay forgotten on the table, but its presence had served its purpose. In sharing his past loss, Igris had found the strength to fight against future loss. In accepting these creatures as family, he had discovered that some bonds were worth dying to protect. Outside, the torches drew closer, carried by men who saw only profit in the capture of legends made flesh. Inside his cabin, an aging hermit and 3 impossible creatures prepared to teach them that some families, once formed, would fight to the last breath rather than be torn apart again. The torches stopped just beyond the tree line, close enough that Igris could make out individual voices carried on the still night air. 3 men, possibly 4, discussing their approach with the casual confidence of hunters who believed they had cornered helpless prey. Their words drifted through the darkness, each sentence a nail in the coffin of the peaceful existence he had tried to build. "Tracks lead right to the old hermit's place," one voice said, gravelly with years of tobacco and whiskey. Figured something was off when we saw all them huge prints around his cabin. You sure the old man's got 'em? This from a younger voice, eager and cruel. Could be they just passed through. Nah. The first voice again, certain and patient. Been watching 3 days now. Smoke's been different, more cooking, more warmth. And yesterday I saw movement through the window that weren't no human shadow. Igris felt his heart sink as he realized how thoroughly they had been observed. Every moment of domestic peace, every meal shared, every gesture of growing trust had been catalogued by unseen watchers. The privacy he had fought 20 years to maintain had been shattered without his knowledge, but it was the third voice that truly chilled him. Older, educated, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Gentlemen, let me remind you of what we're dealing with. The creatures we're seeking are worth more alive than dead, but they're also more dangerous than anything you've ever hunted. The stories might call them peaceful, but a mother protecting her young will kill without hesitation. What about the hermit? The young voice asked. Igris Stoneheart? He's been up here so long he's probably half mad already. Likely doesn't even understand what he's harboring. We'll give him a chance to cooperate, but if he won't see reason, the voice trailed off. But the implication was clear. Behind him, the mother creature had gathered her cubs into a protective huddle, but her attention was focused entirely on the door. Her posture spoke of a decision made. If these men came through that entrance, they would face not just a mother's desperation, but a mother's fury. Igris moved away from the window and began checking his meager weapons. The hunting knife, reliable but requiring close quarters. His rifle, accurate but single shot. A few tools that could serve as weapons in desperate circumstances. Against 4 armed men, with capture equipment and military experience, his chances were negligible. But as he made his preparations, something the educated voice had said nagged at his memory. The man had used his full name, not just Igris, but Igris Stoneheart. Few people knew that name, fewer still would recognize it after 20 years. Most importantly, the voice itself was beginning to stir memories he had tried to bury. The realization hit him like a physical blow, nearly driving him to his knees. He knew that voice, had known it once in circumstances so different from these that it seemed impossible they could be connected. Colonel James Morrison, former United States Army, former commanding officer of the Territorial Militia. The man who had led the investigation into the deaths of Sarah and Emma Stoneheart 20 years ago, Morrison had been one of the few who had not immediately assumed Igris's guilt, who had questioned the convenient timing of the accusations, who had warned him privately that staying to fight the charges might result in a rope around his neck regardless of the truth. Morrison had been the reason he had chosen exile over execution. Now Morrison was here, in these mountains, leading men who sought to capture creatures that existed only in legend. The cruel irony was almost overwhelming. The man who had once saved his life was now threatening the only family he had found since losing everything. The voices outside grew closer, and Igris heard the deliberate sounds of men positioning themselves around his cabin. They were taking no chances, treating this like a military operation with tactical precision. Windows were covered, escape routes blocked, the perimeter secured before any direct approach was attempted. Igris Stoneheart. Morrison's voice carried easily across the clearing. I know you're in there. I know what you're protecting. I'm here under government authority, with papers that give me the right to claim any unusual specimens found in these territories. Igris closed his eyes, remembering Morrison as he had been, younger, idealistic, genuinely concerned with justice rather than profit. Something had changed him, hardened him into the kind of man who would hunt legends for money. I also know, Morrison continued, that you've been branded a deserter and a coward for 20 years. Help me take these creatures alive, and I can arrange for those charges to be dropped. You could go home, Igris. You could clear your name. The offer hung in the air, like smoke from a distant fire. Home. The word had lost all meaning for him years ago. But hearing it spoken aloud stirred emotions he had thought long dead. To return to civilization, to walk among people without fear of recognition. to build something resembling a normal life in his remaining years. All he had to do was betray the family that had accepted him without condition, hand over the creatures who had trusted him with their lives, and watch as they were caged and displayed like carnival attractions. The mother creature was watching him, and somehow she seemed to understand the nature of the choice being offered. Her expression held no accusation, no demand. She was prepared for whatever decision he made, even if it meant her capture and the loss of her cub's freedom. But it was Bold who made the decision inevitable. The young creature, with his fearless curiosity and boundless trust, moved to Igris's side and took his weathered hand in a grip that was both gentle and strong. The gesture said more than words ever could: faith, loyalty, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. "Colonel Morrison," Igris called back, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. "I remember you as a man of honor once. These creatures aren't specimens to be captured. They're a family seeking shelter from men like the ones you're leading tonight. Don't be a fool, Igris. You're protecting monsters that could kill you without a second thought. Help me, and you can have your life back." "I have my life," Igris replied, surprised by the strength in his own voice. "For the first time in 20 years, I have my life." The silence that followed was pregnant with the weight of decisions made and bridges burned. When Morrison spoke again, his voice had lost its reasonable tone, replaced by the cold authority of a military commander dealing with insubordination. "Then you've chosen to die with them. Men, prepare the nets. And remember, we need the specimens alive." But the old man is expendable. Through the window, Igris could see them now, 4 figures moving with practiced coordination, carrying equipment designed for capturing large, dangerous animals. Nets weighted with lead, poles with loops designed to snare and hold, even what looked like a crude cage mounted on wheels for transport. These weren't opportunistic bounty hunters hoping to strike it rich. This was an organized expedition, funded and equipped by people who knew exactly what they were hunting and how much it was worth to the right buyers. The mother creature made a sound that was part growl, part keen of despair. She understood as well as Igris that their time of peace was over. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just their survival, but the future of her cubs, and possibly her entire people. Igris checked his rifle one final time and moved to the door. Behind him, his impossible family prepared for a battle they had never wanted but could no longer avoid. The wanted poster Morrison's men had carried spoke of rewards and riches. But some things, Igris had learned, were worth infinitely more than money. The chess game sat abandoned on his table, the White King still surrounded by threats. But kings were only as strong as those who chose to stand with them. And tonight, in a small cabin in the Wyoming wilderness, a family would stand together against forces that sought to tear them apart. Outside, Colonel Morrison gave the order to begin the assault. Inside, Igris Stoneheart prepared to fight the first battle of his life that truly mattered. In the moments before violence erupted, Igris found himself thinking not of the approaching danger, but of his father's military medal, hidden these 20 years in the bottom of his cedar chest. The bronze disc had been earned in service to the Union Army, passed down with stories of courage under fire and the hard choices that defined a man's character. His father had never spoken much about the war, but he had left his son with one piece of wisdom that suddenly seemed prophetic. "Sometimes, boy, the battle chooses you, and all you can do is meet it with honor." With steady hands despite the chaos of his emotions, Igris retrieved the medal from its resting place. The metal was tarnished, but the inscription remained clear: "For valor above and beyond." As his fingers closed around the familiar weight, memories flooded back. His father teaching him to read terrain, to think tactically, to understand that wars were won not by the strongest, but by the smartest and most determined. "Thank you, Pa," he whispered to the empty air, then turned to face the impossible family that had chosen to stand with him. The mother creature watched him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. When he showed her the medal, explaining with gestures and broken words what it represented, She nodded, with a gravity that suggested she understood completely. Her people, too, must have their own traditions of honoring those who fought to protect what mattered most. Working with the methodical precision his father had drilled into him decades ago, Igris began transforming his peaceful cabin into a fortress. The chess set was carefully moved aside. Those pieces had witnessed too many quiet evenings to be destroyed in the coming battle. But everything else became potential weaponry or defensive positioning. His heavy wooden table, built to last generations, was overturned to create a barrier facing the door. The cubs watched with fascination as he demonstrated how to take cover, how to stay low when danger came calling. Bold seemed eager to be part of the planning, while Cautious absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone who understood that their lives might depend on remembering these lessons. The mother creature proved to be an invaluable ally in these preparations. Her knowledge of the terrain surrounding his cabin was encyclopedic. She knew every boulder that could provide cover, every tree that might stop a bullet, every gully that could serve as an escape route. Using charcoal from his fire and the smooth surface of his cabin wall, they sketched out tactical positions and backup plans. What emerged was a strategy that married his father's military training with her people's generations of experience evading human hunters. If Morrison's men expected to face a helpless hermit and 3 animals, they were about to receive an education in the folly of underestimating desperate families. But it was in teaching the cubs their roles that Igris felt the full weight of what they faced. These young ones, who should have been playing and exploring and learning about their world in safety, were instead learning how to survive a battle they had done nothing to provoke. Bold's eagerness to help was heartbreaking in its innocence, while Cautious's fear was a constant reminder of how much they stood to lose. "Listen to me," Igris said, kneeling before them and speaking with all the authority of a grandfather preparing his grandchildren for the harsh realities of an unfair world. "Your mother and I are going to fight for you. But if something goes wrong, if we tell you to run, you run and don't look back. You understand?" The mother creature translated his words into their language, her vocalizations soft but urgent. Both cubs responded with sounds that seemed to indicate understanding, though Bold's body language suggested he was not entirely committed to the idea of fleeing while others fought on his behalf. As the night deepened, they could hear Morrison's men positioning themselves around the cabin. The sounds were subtle, the kind of careful movement that spoke of military training and experience. These were not random thugs hoping to make easy money. They were professionals, equipped and organized, treating this operation with the seriousness of a military campaign. "They're using standard encirclement tactics," Igris murmured, more to himself than to his companions. 4 points of approach, probably planning simultaneous assault from multiple directions. "They want to overwhelm us with superior numbers and firepower." The mother creature made a questioning sound, and he realized she was asking him to explain what he had observed. Using their makeshift map on the wall, he showed her the likely positions of each attacker, the timing they would probably use, the weak points in their formation that might be exploited. Her response was to add her own intelligence to the tactical picture. With careful gestures, she indicated sounds that his human ears could not detect, the breathing patterns of men under stress, the subtle shifts in position as they prepared their equipment, even the whispered consultations between team members. Her people's enhanced senses provided information no human strategist could access. Together, they refined their defensive plan. The mother would use her strength and knowledge of the terrain to create diversions and confusion. Igris would rely on his rifle and tactical thinking to maximize the effectiveness of their limited resources. The cubs would remain hidden until the outcome was decided, then either celebrate survival or flee to carry on their mother's bloodline. But as they made their final preparations, Igris found himself thinking about legacy in ways he had not considered since his youth. His father's medal represented one kind of valor, the courage to fight for abstract principles like country and honor. Tonight, he would fight for something more concrete but equally important: the right of a family to exist without fear, to live in peace, to raise their young without the threat of capture and exploitation. The medal seemed to warm in his palm as he held it, a tangible connection to generations of men who had faced impossible odds and chosen to stand rather than surrender. His father would understand this choice, he realized, would approve of it, would be proud that his son had finally found something worth the ultimate sacrifice. Outside, a night bird called, but the sound was too perfect, too precisely timed. Morrison was communicating with his men using field signals, coordinating their final approach. The assault would begin within minutes. Igris moved to his rifle and checked the action one final time. The weapon had fed him for 20 years, had never failed him when accuracy mattered. Tonight it would serve a different purpose, but the principle remained the same. When you squeezed the trigger, you had better make the shot count. The mother creature positioned herself where she could protect her cubs while still contributing to the defense. Her massive frame, which had seemed gentle and nurturing in the cabin's domestic setting, now revealed its true power. She was a warrior, Igris realized, born and trained by a lifetime of protecting her people from threats they could not always see coming. Bold and cautious, huddled in the safest corner of the cabin, following their mother's instructions but clearly struggling with the enforced passivity. Their eyes moved constantly between the adults who had become their protectors, seeking reassurance that somehow, despite the impossible odds, their family would survive this night intact. The chess game waited on its board, pieces frozen in eternal conflict. But the real game was about to begin outside these walls, where the stakes were not mere victory or defeat, but the continuation of bloodlines and the preservation of bonds that transcended species. Morrison's voice carried across the clearing one final time, formal and implacable. "Last chance, Stoneheart. Send out the creatures and walk away. You have my word you'll be allowed to leave unharmed." Igris looked at the medal in his hand, then at the family that had chosen him as surely as he had chosen them. Some decisions, he had learned, were larger than the individuals who made them. Some stands had to be taken regardless of the odds against success. "Colonel," he called back, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "Some things are worth more than safe passage. Tonight, you're going to learn what happens when you threaten a family that has nothing left to lose." The silence that followed was the silence before battle, pregnant with the knowledge that within moments, the talking would end and only actions would matter. In that silence, Igris Stoneheart clutched his father's medal and prepared to earn his own. The attack came with the precision of a military operation, but Morrison had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated what desperation could accomplish. When combined with tactical intelligence and unbreakable bonds, Igris had crafted the handmade sling during the final minutes of preparation, using leather scraps from his cobbling supplies and techniques his father had taught him as a boy. It was a simple weapon, primitive compared to the firearms his enemies carried, but it required no powder, made no noise, and in skilled hands could be devastatingly effective. David had faced Goliath with such a weapon, and tonight the story might repeat itself in the Wyoming wilderness. The first assault came from the east window, exactly as Igris had predicted. A weighted net flew through the opening, designed to entangle and subdue anyone inside. But the cabin was empty at that spot. The family had positioned themselves according to their carefully laid plans. Using Morrison's own tactical predictability against him, Igris's rifle spoke first, the muzzle flash illuminating the cabin's interior for one brief moment. Through the smoke, he saw one of Morrison's men stumble backward, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had found its mark. Not a killing shot, but enough to announce that this would not be the easy capture the hunters had expected. "He's armed," someone shouted from outside. "Military formation, watch for crossfire." But the mother creature was already moving, her massive form flowing through the cabin's rear door with a silence that defied her size. Igris caught a glimpse of her disappearing into the forest, becoming one with shadows that would hide her until she chose to strike. Her people had been evading human hunters for generations. Tonight, those skills would serve offense rather than defense. The second assault came from the front door, a coordinated rush designed to overwhelm through sheer force. But instead of finding a frightened hermit and helpless animals, the attackers met the business end of Igris's reloaded rifle. The lead man, young and overconfident, stumbled into the overturned table that served as a barricade. Igris's sling whistled through the air, the stone finding its target with satisfying accuracy. The young hunter dropped his capture pole and fell to his knees, hands pressed to his head where the projectile had struck. Blood seeped between his fingers, and his confident swagger transformed into shocked disbelief. "What the hell?" he began. But his words were cut off by a sound that froze every human heart within a quarter mile. The mother creature's roar echoed through the forest, a vocalization that combined the fury of a grizzly bear with the intelligence of something far more dangerous. It spoke of protective instincts pushed beyond all limits, of a mother prepared to tear apart anyone who threatened her young. Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he shouted new orders. "Perimeter! Watch the trees! She's flanking us." But the creature was already among them, moving through the darkness with an efficiency that spoke of perfect knowledge of every rock, every tree, every hiding place within miles of the cabin. The sounds that reached Igris told the story. Men shouting in confusion, equipment being scattered, the panic of hunters suddenly finding themselves prey. From his position inside the cabin, Igris kept his rifle trained on the door while listening to the chaos outside. The cubs remained hidden where he had positioned them, though he could see Bold peering around the corner with eyes that missed nothing. The young one was learning lessons tonight that would serve him well if he lived long enough to use them. A shadow appeared at the west window, Morrison himself, attempting to flank the position while his men dealt with the mother creature's diversionary attack. But Igris had anticipated this move, had prepared for the moment when the leader would abandon tactics in favor of direct action. The sling spoke again, its leather pouch loaded with a jagged stone that caught Morrison across the temple with enough force to stagger him. The colonel fell backward, his capture equipment clattering to the ground, blood streaming down his face. "You always were too predictable. James," Igris called out using Morrison's first name deliberately. "Even 20 years ago you telegraphed your moves." "Igris?" Morrison's voice carried shock and recognition. What are you doing up here?" "Living the life you gave me when you warned me to run," Igris replied, moving to a new position as he reloaded his rifle. "Funny how things work out." The mother creature's roar came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through underbrush. One of Morrison's men screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a knife. Whatever was happening in the forest, the hunters were learning that they had gravely underestimated their prey. Morrison struggled to his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding head. "Those things will kill us all, Igris. You're protecting monsters." "No, James," Igris replied, his sling already loaded with another stone. "I'm protecting family. Something you clearly don't understand anymore. The battle was far from over, but the first engagement had gone to the defenders." Morrison's men were scattered, wounded, and facing an enemy they had not prepared for. But Igris knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Cornered men were dangerous, and Morrison had not survived decades of frontier conflict by giving up at the first setback. Morrison's retreat was tactical rather than panicked, and Igris recognized the dangerous intelligence behind it. The colonel was regrouping, calling his scattered men back to a defensible position while reassessing the threat he faced. When Morrison's voice rang out again, it carried the authority of a military commander, adapting to battlefield conditions. "Burn them out," he ordered. "Fire arrows, anything that will catch. We'll take them as they flee." The first flaming arrow struck the cabin's eastern wall, the oil-soaked rag wrapped around its tip, catching the weathered wood with hungry efficiency. Within moments, flames began climbing toward the roof that had sheltered Igris for 20 years. The home he had built with his own hands, the sanctuary that had protected him through 2 decades of solitude. was being sacrificed to save the family he had found in his final chapter. But as he watched his life's work begin to burn, Igris felt no despair. Instead, a strange peace settled over him. The burning cabin timber represented transformation, the destruction of his old, isolated existence to protect something infinitely more precious. Sometimes salvation required sacrifice. Sometimes the phoenix could only rise from ashes. "Come on," he said to the cubs, who watched the spreading flames with wide, frightened eyes. "Time to go." The mother creature materialized from the forest, as if summoned by his words, her massive form appearing in the cabin's rear doorway. She was bleeding from several wounds, knife cuts and what looked like a bullet graze along her ribs, but her eyes burned with undiminished determination. Behind her, Igris could see one of Morrison's men lying motionless among the trees, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. As they prepared to evacuate the burning cabin, Bo did something that nearly stopped Igris's heart. The young creature ran to the table where the chess set still sat, carefully gathering the carved pieces in his small arms. Even with flames spreading overhead and death closing in from all sides, the cub was trying to save the game that had meant so much to the human who had become his grandfather. "Leave them," Igris started to say. But then he saw the determination in Bol's eyes. These pieces represented more than a game to the young one. They were symbols of the quiet evenings they had shared, the bond that had formed between species, the proof that different worlds could meet in peace. If Bold thought they were worth saving, then perhaps they were. They emerged from the burning cabin into a nightmare of smoke and chaos. Morrison had positioned his remaining men in a semicircle, using the flames to force their quarry into a killing zone. Capture nets waited to entangle, while rifles were trained on every possible escape route. The colonel himself stood at the center of the formation, his wounded head wrapped in makeshift bandaging, but his eyes cold with professional determination. "Surrender the creatures, Igris," Morrison called out. "You've fought well, but it's over. Don't throw your life away for animals." "They're not animals," Igris replied, positioning himself between the cubs and Morrison's rifles. "They're people, James. They have families, traditions, intelligence, everything you've forgotten in your hunt for profit." The mother creature moved to stand beside him, her massive form providing a living shield for her young. Together, human and Bigfoot faced the semicircle of armed men with the quiet dignity of those who had chosen their ground and would not retreat from it. But Morrison had made a critical error in his tactical positioning. By using the burning cabin to force their movement, he had driven them toward the forest edge, where the mother creature's people had their ancient pathways. And from those pathways, help was coming. The first shadow emerged from the trees behind Morrison's line, another adult Bigfoot, this one even larger than the mother creature. Then another and another, until the forest seemed alive with massive forms moving with lethal purpose. The mother's desperate sounds during the battle had not been mere roars of fury. They had been calls for aid, ancient signals that brought her extended family to answer the threat. Morrison's men found themselves caught between the burning cabin and an entire community of creatures they had thought existed only in legend. The tables had turned completely. The hunters had become the hunted, surrounded by beings whose strength and intelligence far exceeded their own. "My God," Morrison whispered, his rifle trembling in hands that had faced down human enemies without flinching. How many of them are there?" The lead Bigfoot, an enormous patriarch whose presence commanded respect even from his own people, approached Morrison with measured steps. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ages, the authority of a species that had survived human expansion through wisdom rather than warfare. "Enough," the patriarch said in carefully pronounced English that shocked every human present. "Enough to protect our own. Leave now and live. Stay, and join your companion in the earth." Morrison looked toward the trees where his dead subordinate lay, then back at the circle of creatures whose eyes reflected the flames of the burning cabin. His military training had prepared him for many things, but not for facing an entire hidden civilization that had chosen to reveal itself rather than allow one family to be destroyed. Slowly, deliberately, Morrison lowered his rifle. The battle was over, decided not by superior firepower, but by the simple truth that some bonds could summon armies when threatened. The burning timbers of Igris's cabin cast dancing shadows on the faces of two peoples who would remember this night as the moment when their worlds finally, truly met. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, as if the mountain itself sought to heal the wounds of winter's final violent storm. Where Igris's cabin had once stood, green shoots pushed through the ash-enriched soil, creating a small meadow that would have made Sarah smile. In the center of this new growth stood a simple wooden cross, not marking a grave, but commemorating the burial of one life and the birth of another. 3 months had passed since the night Morrison and his remaining men had disappeared into the forest, never to return to the mining camps with tales of creatures captured or fortunes made. The official story, according to the few who bothered to ask, was that a late-season avalanche had claimed the hunting party. The mountains, it was said, had simply swallowed them whole. Igris Stoneheart knew the truth was more complex and more merciful than that. The Bigfoot patriarch had offered Morrison a choice: leave these mountains forever and never speak of what he had witnessed or face the consequences of his greed. Morrison, for all his faults, had been a soldier long enough to recognize when he was outmatched. The last Igris had seen of his former colonel was a figure disappearing down the mountain trails, supported by his surviving men and carrying the weight of knowledge that would die with him. Now, as Igris sat in the doorway of his new shelter, a structure built with both human engineering and Bigfoot craftsmanship, he marveled at how thoroughly his world had transformed. The dwelling was larger than his old cabin, constructed of stone and timber in a design that honored both traditions. Windows faced east to catch the morning sun, while the main room centered around a hearth large enough to warm beings of many sizes. The cubs, no longer quite cubs, sat on either side of him. Bold had grown several inches taller and had appointed himself Igris's official protector, despite being told repeatedly that such protection went both ways. Cautious, still more reserved but no longer fearful, had developed a fascination with the chess pieces she had watched Bold save from the burning cabin. She was learning the game with the methodical precision that characterized her approach to everything. "Your move, grandfather," Bold said in the hybrid language they had developed over the months, part English, part Bigfoot, part gesture and expression. The title had emerged naturally, neither requested nor formally granted, simply acknowledged as the truth of their relationship. Igris studied the board, noting how the positions had changed from that long-ago game that had waited unfinished for so many months. The White King was no longer surrounded, no longer facing impossible odds. Strategic alliances had shifted the entire balance, creating possibilities that had not existed when the pieces first took their positions. "Patience," he replied, using the Bigfoot word the cubs had taught him. "Good moves take time to develop." The mother, who had finally shared her name, a complex vocalization that translated roughly as "mountain walker who protects," emerged from the forest, carrying the day's gathering. Her wounds from the battle had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that she wore like medals of honor. In her arms were herbs and roots that she had been teaching him to identify, expanding his knowledge of the mountain's pharmacy beyond anything he had learned in 20 years of solitude. "The council meets tomorrow," she said in her careful English, a language she had been learning with the same determination her cubs applied to chess. "The patriarch wants your thoughts on the new boundaries." Igris nodded, still amazed by his role in this hidden civilization's governance. The Bigfoot people, he had learned, made decisions collectively, weighing the wisdom of all community members regardless of species. His human perspective, his knowledge of how his own people thought and moved, had proven valuable in establishing protocols that would protect both communities while allowing for limited, careful contact. It was not the retirement he had envisioned when he first fled to these mountains, but it was infinitely richer than the isolation he had thought he wanted. The cubs brought him flowers they had picked during their explorations, asked him to settle disputes with the authority of a recognized elder, and curled up beside him during evening stories that bridged the gap between human folklore and Bigfoot oral tradition. The chess set had been repaired and expanded, carved pieces representing new players and new possibilities. Where once he had played endless games against himself, now he taught strategy to eager students who brought fresh perspectives to ancient patterns. Bold favored aggressive attacks and bold sacrifices, while cautious preferred defensive positions that could become devastating counterattacks given time and patience. But it was in the quiet moments, when the day's activities settled into evening peace, that Igris felt the full measure of his transformation. The photograph of Sarah and Emma remained with him, but no longer as a source of pain. Instead, it served as a bridge between his old family and his new one. Proof that love could transcend loss, that bonds could be rebuilt even after they seemed permanently broken. As the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered him for more than 20 years, Igris watched his cubs practice their lessons while their mother prepared the evening meal. The simple wooden cross in the meadow caught the last rays of light, marking not an end, but a beginning, the point where one life had died so another could be born. The lonely hermit who had opened his door to impossible creatures on a bitter February night no longer existed. In his place sat a grandfather, a teacher, a bridge between worlds. A man who had learned that the greatest adventures often came disguised as the smallest acts of kindness. The chess game waited, pieces arranged for tomorrow's lesson. But tonight, as his impossible family gathered around their shared hearth, Igris Stoneheart understood that he had already won the only game that truly mattered. He had chosen love over fear, family over solitude, and in doing so had discovered that some legends were born not from grand gestures, but from the simple courage to open one's door when strangers came calling in the storm.